Julian called me just a clerk in front of his parents, the waiter, and half the restaurant. He did not whisper it. He did not catch himself halfway through and pull it back with an apology. He leaned away from the table, loosened his tie the way men do when they want a room to notice them surviving something exhausting, and said clearly, "I can't keep pretending this is a partnership when you file papers for a living and I'm trying to build a real future." His mother looked down at her plate like the pattern suddenly required her full attention. His father took a slow, deliberate sip of wine. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. The silence sat heavy on the table. My engagement ring felt suddenly too tight, like something borrowed that I had no right to be wearing. I had spent 4 years helping Julian become the man who now looked embarrassed to sit across from me. I edited his job applications at midnight. I covered our bills when his commissions ran late. I listened to his fear when interviews went badly and celebrated every small win like it belonged to both of us. Then he stood up, threw his napkin onto the table with force, and said, "I'm done carrying someone with no ambition. My name is Marin Whitlock," and what Julian did not know was that the job invite sitting unread in my inbox came with executive security protocols, because just a clerk was exactly the kind of person trusted with secrets men like him were not allowed to touch. I made it to the restaurant bathroom before I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way that would give the dining room something to stare at. Just one hand braced hard against the cold sink, one hand pressed over my mouth, trying not to let strangers hear the sound of my life cracking apart. Then my phone buzzed again in my purse. I almost ignored it. My mascara was already burning my eyes. My hands were shaking too badly to hold anything steady. The last thing I needed was another notification from someone who had just witnessed my humiliation. But the subject line pulled my eyes down before I could stop them. Executive Operations Interview. Confidential Integration Team. I opened it standing there in that bathroom, mascara already streaking down my face in dark lines. The message was from my company's chief of staff, Odette Val. She wrote that my work reconstructing contract histories and access records had been noticed by senior leadership. A confidential acquisition project needed someone who understood documents, timelines, discretion, and operational risk management. Then came the line that made me stop breathing entirely. Due to the sensitivity of this assignment, your interview will follow executive security protocols. I stared at myself in the mirror. Mascara streaked. Ring still on my finger. Heart completely broken. And somehow selected for something that mattered. Julian had walked out because he thought I filed papers. He had no idea I had spent 4 years reading the walls holding companies together. I cleaned my face, fixed what I could, and walked back to the table. Julian was already gone. His parents were still sitting there. That was somehow worse than finding an empty table. His mother folded her napkin with tiny, nervous movements, smoothing it again and again like it might protect her from what came next. His father cleared his throat carefully and said, "Marin, Julian has been unhappy for some time now." Unhappy. That polite, sanitized word for cruelty that had clearly been discussed behind my back in conversations I was never invited to. His mother added softly, "He needs someone who can move in the same circles." Same circles. As if love was a networking event. I looked at the black leather folder sitting in the middle of the table. The check. Julian had left without paying for the dinner he had used to break my heart. Of course he had. I picked up my purse, pulled out my card, and placed it in the folder because I refused to let the waiter become collateral damage in my public humiliation. This was not his fault. His father watched me handle the bill and said, "You're taking this well." I looked directly at him. "No, I'm taking it privately." His mouth closed. I signed the receipt without looking at the total. Outside, the night air hit my face like cold water. I welcomed the shock of it. I removed the ring in the parking lot under the yellow streetlights and put it carefully in the side pocket of my purse, where I would not have to see it or feel it pressing against my skin. Then I drove home alone through streets that looked different than they had 2 hours ago. The radio played something cheerful that I turned off immediately. I needed the quiet. Julian's side of the closet was completely empty when I got home. His shoes were gone from the rack by the door. His laptop was gone from the desk. The framed photo from our engagement trip to the coast was face down on the dresser, like even the memory had been formally dismissed and filed away. He had planned the walkout. That hurt more than the words at the restaurant. He had not lost control at dinner. This was not a moment of weakness or anger that spiraled. He had staged a careful exit, hired movers, rented storage, and left me to perform heartbreak politely in front of his parents while he disappeared. On the kitchen counter sat a note written in his careful handwriting. "I'll arrange for the rest later. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." That sentence did something strange to me. Please. As if he was the reasonable one. As if I was the one making things difficult. I opened our shared household expense spreadsheet on my laptop with hands that wanted to shake, but did not. 3 recent withdrawals jumped out immediately. $200 for a moving company, $150 for a storage unit deposit, and $85 for a dinner reservation deposit at a restaurant that was not Ravello's. He had used our joint money to fund his exit from our shared life. My hands started shaking then. I sat very still for 45 seconds and let the feeling move through me without acting on it. Then I created a new folder on my desktop. I labeled it Julian Records. I saved screenshots of the bank statements, a photo of the note, and the timeline of everything I could remember. I did not know yet exactly what I would need it all for. I only knew that I had spent 4 years watching people underestimate the power of documentation. I was not going to make the same mistake. Julian sent the group message to our mutual friends before midnight. I ended the engagement. I care about Marin, but we want different lives. I need ambition, growth, and someone who understands what I'm building for my future. Someone replied with a flexed arm emoji. Another person wrote back quickly, "You deserve an equal." I stared at the word equal on my phone screen until my vision blurred and the letters stopped making sense. For 4 years, Julian had borrowed my calm when his own life got unstable and chaotic. He used my careful budgeting system when his bonus checks were delayed or smaller than promised. He asked me to proofread his client proposals because I noticed things other people missed. He called it help. He called it partnership. He called it teamwork when it was convenient. But in the story he was now telling, I was the weight holding him down, not the structure holding him up. My sister Talia called my phone exactly 10 minutes after the message posted to the group. "I saw it," she said immediately. Her voice was tight. "Are you safe right now?" That question nearly broke me completely. Not what happened, or is it true, or what did you do wrong? Just, are you safe? Like she already understood the full size of what he had just done to me in public. I sat down slowly on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and cried, while Talia stayed on the phone without trying to fill the silence with empty comfort. When I could finally speak without my voice breaking, I said, "He thinks I'm nothing." Talia answered firmly, "Then let him be wrong from a very long distance." In the morning, I had an executive security interview to prepare for, and I was going to show up. The security guard in the main lobby knew my name before I gave it to him. That had never happened to me before in 4 years of working at this company. "Marin Whitlock? Miss Vale is expecting you upstairs." He handed me a visitor badge with a bright red stripe running down the center and asked me to place my phone in a locked security pouch before going up to the executive floors. My hands tightened automatically around the strap of my bag. A records clerk did not usually get escorted to the executive floor with security protocols. A records clerk usually got waved toward the freight elevator in the back with a cart full of labeled boxes and told which floor to deliver them to. But that morning, everything was different. A woman in a sharp navy blazer appeared at the reception desk and said, "I'll walk you up personally." Her name was Sable Wynn, corporate security. In the elevator riding up, she explained the rules calmly and clearly. No discussion of the interview content outside approved channels. No sharing project names or acquisition details. No confirming whether the work involved internal staff, external bidders, or vendor relationships. Then she looked at me and smiled slightly. "We take discretion very seriously here." I thought of Julian leaning back in his chair at dinner and saying paper filing like it was something embarrassing that needed to be apologized for. For the first time in 24 hours, The wound in my chest did not feel like proof of my smallness. It felt like evidence that he had never actually understood what I carried or what I was capable of. The elevator doors opened smoothly onto the executive floor. I stepped out into a different world. Odette Val did not waste my time with small talk. She explained quickly and clearly that my company, North Star Relocation Group, was in the process of acquiring a smaller logistics platform. The integration was extremely sensitive because several outside consulting firms had advised competing bidders during the process, and certain vendor contracts needed very careful review before the deal could close. Then she placed a thick binder down on the table directly in front of me. I saw the company name before I had time to prepare myself for it. Pierce Calder Consulting. Julian's firm. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Odette noticed my reaction immediately. Her eyes were sharp. Do you have a conflict of interest we should know about? I could have lied. For one weak, tempting second, I genuinely wanted to. I wanted the job. I wanted to prove Julian wrong about everything. I wanted to not be the woman whose collapsed engagement complicated a major career opportunity. But I had spent 4 years learning that undisclosed conflicts always end up costing more than disclosed ones. My former fiancé works there, I said clearly. At Pierce Calder. Odette nodded once. Not disappointed, not surprised. Thank you for that disclosure. Honest transparency is exactly what we need in this role. She slid a formal conflict of interest form across the polished table. Not punishment for having a complication. Process for managing it properly. That difference meant everything to me. I signed the form carefully and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. I had just chosen integrity over convenience. And it felt like the first honest choice I had made in years. There was more information Odette needed to share with me. Julian's team at Pierce Calder had formally requested early access to integration documents related to the acquisition. Not Julian personally submitting the request? Not yet, anyway, but the formal request had come through his department weeks earlier. Odette explained that the access request had been denied because the acquisition was still under heavily restricted review at that stage of the process. Sitting in that conference room, I suddenly remembered Julian asking me casual questions over dinner for weeks before the breakup. Any interesting new clients coming through lately? Is your company still looking at platform deals in the logistics space? Do clerks even hear about acquisitions at the executive level? Or is that kind of thing above where you sit? At the time, I had thought he was just belittling my work, making me feel small in that particular way he had perfected. Now, sitting across from Odette, I wondered if he had actually been fishing for information while pretending to mock the pond. Odette asked me directly, "Did he ever explicitly ask you for documents or internal information?" "No," I said honestly. "Never documents. But he did ask questions, specific ones." Sable Wynn, who had been sitting quietly, started documenting everything immediately. Dates I could remember. Exact phrases when I could recall them. Any mention of platform deals, vendor reviews, or acquisition timelines. It felt awful, like turning 4 years of relationship history into evidence for a security file. But Odette looked at me and said something that became foundational. "Marin, his behavior is not your fault. But your honesty protects this process." That sentence became the first brick in my new foundation. A foundation built on truth instead of managing someone else's ego or protecting someone else's feelings. The formal offer letter came exactly 2 hours after the interview ended. Executive Operations Documentation Lead. Temporary project-based role with a clearly defined path to permanent leadership position. Significantly higher salary than my current grade level. Restricted floor badge access. Mandatory security escort during executive briefings. Comprehensive confidentiality obligations. Formal vendor conflict firewall to manage the Pierce Calder situation. I read through the entire offer sitting alone in a small glass-walled conference room, with Sable Wynn standing just outside the door watching. My eyes filled with tears before I could stop them or push them back down. Odette handed me a tissue box without making it into something dramatic or uncomfortable. "Is this too much for you right now?" she asked gently. "Given everything that just happened?" I shook my head hard. "No. It's not too much. It's just the first time something genuinely good has happened to me without me needing to make someone else comfortable about it first. Her expression softened in a way that made her look almost maternal. Then take up space carefully and thoughtfully, but take it. I signed the offer letter with my hand shaking slightly. When I walked back out through the main lobby 30 minutes later, Sable escorted me all the way to the parking garage. My temporary red-striped security badge was clipped visibly to my blazer. My engagement ring was gone from my finger. My future felt suddenly louder and more real than Julian's insult had ever been. I sat in my car and texted my sister Talia one single word. Yes. She texted back immediately with 3 words. I knew it. And I believed her. Julian's text message made me stop walking in the middle of the parking garage. Heard you got escorted upstairs by security today? Did they finally fire you too? That word, too. As if being publicly discarded by him at a restaurant and being formally removed by my company somehow belonged in the same category of shame. I almost typed back immediately. No, actually, I got promoted. Then I remembered the confidentiality agreement I had signed less than 2 hours ago. The NDA was clear and specific. Instead of responding to Julian, I forwarded his entire message to both Sable and Odette without any commentary. Sable replied within 4 minutes. Documented. Do not engage with him directly. That instruction felt strange in a way that also felt like relief washing over me. For 4 solid years, every single text message from Julian had required intensive emotional labor from me. I had to read his mood carefully, calm his fears, defend my tone, manage his insecurities, prove my intentions, explain my choices, soften my words. Every message had been a small performance of patience I put on for an audience of exactly 1 person. Now a clean professional process was absorbing the impact instead of my body. I did not have to explain myself. I did not have to correct his assumptions. I did not have to bleed on command. That evening, I drove to Talia's apartment across town and showed her only what I was legally allowed to show. The job title on the offer letter, the salary number, and the phrase confidentiality obligations printed in bold. She read the letter slowly twice, then looked up at me. He called you just a clerk at dinner? I nodded. She said quietly, Good. Let that be the last accurate thing he ever knows about you. I smiled for the first time in 2 days. At first, Julian's questions filtering through our mutual friends were relatively vague and easy to dismiss. Is Marin doing okay? Did something happen at her work? Is North Star going through some kind of restructuring? Then, over the course of about a week, his questions started getting sharper and much more specific. Is North Star buying a logistics platform right now? Is Pierce Calder still blocked from accessing the data room? Did Marin mention anything about vendor review processes? My friend Oren forwarded me the last message with 1 line attached at the bottom. This feels really off to me. It felt off because it was off. It was also now something I was required to report under my new security protocols. Sable asked me to forward all the screenshots and provide the names of everyone Julian had contacted. Odette personally notified the legal department. My formal conflict firewall was officially expanded to cover indirect contact. Sitting in that meeting, I felt embarrassed all over again. Like Julian's behavior was mud-caked on my shoes, tracking into professional rooms where I desperately wanted to look capable and clean. Odette must have seen something in my face because she stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at me. Marin, do not confuse proximity to risk with responsibility for risk. I wrote that sentence down in my notebook as soon as I got back to my desk, because loving Julian had taught me exactly the opposite lesson for 4 years. If he was angry about something, I managed it. If he was insecure, I softened myself. If he crossed a line, I quietly cleaned up the footprints. Not anymore. That pattern was over. Pierce Calder Consulting received a formal written notice from North Star's legal department. Not an accusation of wrongdoing. A clear boundary being set. The letter stated that North Star had documented a pattern of informal inquiries being made by a Pierce Calder employee who had a disclosed personal connection to someone working on a restricted internal project. All future communication about the acquisition had to remain strictly through approved legal channels. Julian called my phone within 20 minutes of that letter being delivered to his firm. I let it go straight to voicemail. His voice came through tight, fast and furious when I listened to it later. You actually reported me? After everything I did for you? You're using some fake executive position to punish me because I had the courage to end things? Fake executive position. I listened to the message exactly once, saved it to my phone, forwarded it to both Sable and Odette. Then I sat on Talia's couch that evening and stared at the wall for a long time without moving. The part that hurt was not his anger at me. I had learned to outlast Julian's anger years ago. What hurt was the depressing realization of how easily and automatically he believed that my professional success had to be fake unless it somehow existed to serve him directly. He could not imagine me earning something real that he had not given me access to. Talia sat down beside me without saying anything for a while. Finally she spoke. You're not punishing him, Marin. You're just not letting him use you anymore. That distinction felt small in the moment. It was actually everything. I was finally learning the crucial difference between cruelty and boundaries. Julian's firm opened a formal internal ethics review. I found out through North Star's legal team, sending me a professional update, not through gossip or mutual friends talking. That mattered more than it might sound. Everything was moving through proper channels now, which meant Julian could not charm or smooth talk the narrative into something softer that made him look better. The review was examining whether he had inappropriately used a personal relationship to seek information about a restricted acquisition process. Julian initially claimed no. Absolutely not. He denied everything. Then the documentation started surfacing. Screenshots of his messages to Oren asking specific questions. The voicemail he left me that I had forwarded to security. His department's formal early access request. His own words about being blocked from the data room. Language that should not exist in casual conversation if someone genuinely has no knowledge of a confidential process. None of it was technically a crime. But in the consulting world, trust is the only currency that actually matters. And Julian had just spent his without realizing the account was being watched. Meanwhile, I began my actual work in my new role. My first major task was reconstructing a complete contract timeline from 5 years of scattered, disorganized records that no one had ever properly centralized. It was exactly the kind of careful, detailed, slow work that I had always genuinely loved. Odette reviewed my finished timeline after I submitted it and said simply, "This is exactly why we brought you in." I thought of Julian at the restaurant. Just a clerk. Yes, I thought. Exactly. That was the whole point he had never understood. Clerks know where truth lives. The discovery happened completely by accident. North Star's legal team was systematically reviewing all outside consultant materials that had been submitted during vendor evaluation processes related to the acquisition. In one archived Pierce Calder presentation deck, I saw a phrase that stopped me cold. Document memory is operational memory. I had written that exact line in an internal training note I created 2 years earlier. It was my specific way of explaining to people who thought records work was boring or tedious why it actually mattered deeply. If contracts, approvals, and exceptions were not properly traceable, companies literally forgot the promises they had made to themselves. Julian used to tease me about that phrase when I said it. Apparently, he had also quietly copied it. The presentation deck had his name listed as primary author on the cover slide. I sat very still at my desk. There were other pieces scattered throughout too. My specific phrasing, my checklist logic structure, my retention risk categories. None of it was classified North Star information that belonged to the company, but it was absolutely my personal intellectual labor being repackaged cleanly as his original insight. I told Odette about it, not emotionally, not with anger. Professionally and factually. She immediately asked legal to document the authorship concerns because the deck was part of the official vendor evaluation history connected to the acquisition. For 4 years, Julian had openly mocked the work that secretly made him sound smarter to his supervisors and clients. Now the permanent record knew what he had done with it. And records, unlike people, do not forget or forgive. Julian's previous promotion nomination from 6 months earlier praised his unique understanding of documentation risk management. I actually laughed out loud when I read that line in the file. Not because it was funny, because grief had finally made enough room inside me for disgust to move in. Unique understanding. He had called my work filing papers at dinner, then systematically used my language and frameworks to become the kind of man who deserved better than me. North Star could not directly punish him for copying non-confidential ideas from a former romantic partner, unless Pierce Calder itself chose to take action. That was not North Star's lane or authority. But because the deck had been formally submitted during vendor evaluation, his firm was now obligated to answer specific questions about originality, proper authorship attribution, and whether Julian had misrepresented his personal contributions. Pierce Calder's compliance team requested an official statement from me through legal counsel. I gave them facts only, specific dates, original documents with timestamps, my original training notes with metadata showing creation dates, no emotional language, no insults, no speculation about his character or motivations, just cold, clean documentation. When I finished the statement, Sable looked at me and said, "You're remarkably controlled." I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said finally. "I'm not controlled. I'm just very tired of men professionally benefiting from my complete lack of records." She smiled slightly and said, "Then make sure you always have records going forward." I already did. I had been quietly building them for years. Julian sent me one final message before I blocked him completely. "You're acting like I stole your entire life. I helped you become organized. I pushed you to want more. Now you're punishing me through corporate channels because I had the courage to outgrow you." I read it twice all the way through. Then I realized something surprising. I was not sad anymore. I was just bored. Bored of the exact same repetitive structure we had been trapped in. Julian did something that crossed a line. I reacted to it. He then called my reaction proof that he was right about me all along. Over and over and over. I forwarded the message to Sable without any commentary. Then I blocked his number completely on my phone. That evening, I methodically packed up the last remaining pieces of his things from my apartment. A watch box from his dresser, 2 hardcover books with his name written inside the front covers, 1 framed award he had left behind, and the travel mug he somehow never remembered to wash. I did not include a note. I did not spray perfume on anything. I did not make any kind of dramatic final gesture. I used a completely neutral courier service and kept the printed receipt in my Julian Records folder. The next morning when I arrived at work, my badge access had been quietly upgraded from temporary red stripe to permanent executive project access. It felt symbolic in a way I did not quite trust myself to say out loud yet. 1 door had closed. 3 others had opened quietly behind it. And I was walking through all of them. The deeper background and security interview happened the following week. It was not uncomfortable because I had done anything wrong. It was uncomfortable because it asked very direct questions about different kinds of pressure in my life. Financial pressure that might make someone vulnerable. Romantic pressure from partners who might want access to restricted information. Family pressure that could create conflicts of loyalty, whether anyone currently close to me had reason to seek confidential information. Whether anyone had already tried, I answered every single question completely truthfully. Julian had reason to want access. Julian had already tried to get it indirectly. Julian no longer had any access to me or my life. The interviewer's name was Calvin Ames. He did not look at me with pity or judgment. He simply asked for all supporting documentation and thanked me sincerely for my clarity and transparency. At the end of the interview, he said something I wrote down immediately afterward. People very often hide personal complications because they fear it makes them look like a security risk. In our experience, the hiding itself is almost always the actual risk. I thought about how Julian had called me small and overcautious for being so careful about everything. Being careful was the exact thing that was saving me now. That same afternoon, my full permanent access was formally approved. Executive project floor, confidential integration room, restricted legal archive, complete vendor review history, all of it. Because the company had decided to trust my judgment under pressure. Julian had always measured ambition by titles on business cards and how many important people knew your name. My new role measured it by integrity under pressure. Pierce Calder's internal review eventually found language traced back to my personal notes in 3 separate presentation decks. Again, nothing that was classified North Star property. Nothing technically stolen from my company. But enough of a clear pattern to raise serious internal authorship and attribution concerns. Julian's direct supervisor was forced to admit in writing that he had specifically praised Julian multiple times for fresh frameworks and original thinking that Julian had apparently never properly sourced or credited. That phrase, fresh frameworks, did something painful to me. My late nights working while he watched television. My careful systems, built over years. My clerk brain that he had mocked at dinner. His professionally recognized fresh frameworks. The review also uncovered that Julian had asked a junior analyst to clean up the document version history before submitting materials for the acquisition-related bid evaluation. That discovery was somehow worse than the copying. Not illegal exactly, but deliberately deceptive in a way that showed intent. His firm formally removed him from the active bid team while the internal review continued. The same bid team he had been desperately trying to impress when he started asking me those casual questions about my work over dinner. That evening, Talia asked me directly if I felt victorious. I thought about it. No, I said honestly. I don't feel victorious. I feel like my life is finally correcting its own spelling errors. She understood exactly what I meant. Julian had been actively up for a promotion to senior client strategist. The role came with a significant raise, comprehensive travel accounts, and exactly the kind of status and recognition he had always worshipped like it was oxygen. The internal ethics review paused his nomination immediately. Then the formal acquisition bid restrictions and vendor firewall made the pause permanent. His supervisor's written assessment stated clearly that Julian had demonstrated poor professional judgment regarding personal information boundaries and appropriate attribution standards. Professional attribution. Such a clean, neutral, corporate phrase for systematically taking ideas and language from the woman he had publicly called just a clerk. I did not celebrate when I found out. I simply went to work, like I did every morning. I spent that entire morning in a secure glass conference room, carefully building a comprehensive document map for executive leadership review, tracking every contract, every approval, every exception, across 5 full years of records. At lunch, Odette told me that the Integration Steering Committee wanted me to present my findings at the next scheduled meeting. Me. Standing at the front of a room full of executives. Presenting my work. Not filing papers quietly in the background while someone else took credit. I went to the bathroom right after that conversation, locked myself in a stall, and cried silently for exactly 2 minutes. Not from fear of the presentation. From the unfamiliar and overwhelming relief of being seen in a way that did not hurt. Being seen had always hurt before. This time it felt different. This time it felt like being recognized. Julian's mother called me from an unknown number I did not recognize. I almost answered it because old habits are incredibly powerful and hard to break. Then I let it go to voicemail instead. Her message was soft in tone but sharp in its actual purpose. Marin, I know you're hurting right now, but Julian's career really shouldn't have to suffer just because a relationship didn't work out. You know better than anyone how hard he's worked to get where he is. I listened to it exactly once, saved it carefully to my phone, forwarded it to Sable immediately because of the established no-contact guidance. Then I sat alone in my quiet kitchen and thought about one specific sentence. You know how hard he worked. I did know. I had watched him work hard for 4 years. I had also worked hard myself. That fact had never once seemed to matter to her or register as important. I sent exactly one message back through my attorney. Please direct all future contact through appropriate legal representatives. No emotional defense of myself, no explanation of my side. No desperate plea to be understood by people who had sat silently at a table and watched me pay for dinner while their son walked out on me. That night, I cooked myself simple pasta in my own quiet kitchen. It tasted like absolutely nothing special. But the silence surrounding me felt entirely and completely mine. That was the thing I genuinely had not expected. That belonging fully to yourself could feel that specific and that calm all at once. The steering committee meeting had 12 senior executives, 2 corporate attorneys, 1 security officer, and me. Exactly 1 month earlier, Julian had looked embarrassed and said out loud that I filed papers for a living. Now I stood calmly at the front of that room and explained clearly why the document history showed a significant vendor access problem that needed to be addressed. I did not mention Julian by name. I did not need to mention him. The records I had built told the story themselves. The permanent documentation showed that Pierce Calder had formally submitted 3 separate early data room access requests over 6 weeks. Each one routed through slightly different internal channels as though testing which path might work. One request specifically contained language that overlapped with internal acquisition terminology that had not been released publicly at that stage. Because I had disclosed my conflict from the very beginning of this process, a completely independent second analyst had been assigned to verify all my findings separately. That fact mattered enormously. The evidence stood solid without me having to lean on it personally. Legal formally recommended keeping Pierce Calder outside the restricted bid process until all internal reviews were completely closed. Odette looked around the room and asked if there were any objections to that recommendation. There were none. Just like that, the firm Julian had strained everything to impress lost their access to the most important bid of their quarter. Not because I wanted revenge on him, because documents tell the truth, even when people will not. That had always been the entire point of the work. Julian was not fired from Pierce Calder. Real consequences are often much quieter than the dramatic endings we imagine when we are in pain and want justice. He was formally removed from all acquisition-adjacent work. His senior strategist nomination was permanently withdrawn. He was placed under ongoing ethics monitoring. He was reassigned to internal research, far away from client-facing rooms, far from the expensive dinners, far from the status he had built his entire self-image around. For a man who had measured his worth by whose name he could drop casually in a sentence, it was a slow and very specific kind of professional collapse. Pierce Calder also issued a corrected internal document note, publicly acknowledging that several frameworks presented in Julian's work had drawn on informal external source material provided without proper attribution or permission. That phrasing was corporate and ugly. It was also completely accurate. My attorney sent Julian a formal legal notice prohibiting any further use of my personal intellectual materials without explicit written consent. He did not reply to the notice. Good. I did not need or want a reply from him. That same afternoon, Northstar's executive team formally confirmed that my temporary project role would automatically convert to a permanent leadership position after the acquisition officially closed. The timeline felt almost too perfectly poetic. His access closed completely, mine opened wider, and I walked forward into it without looking back at what I was leaving behind. The acquisition officially closed on a Friday morning in late autumn. There was no champagne fountain or dramatic celebration, just tired people clapping politely in a conference room, bad coffee in paper cups, and Odette Val standing up to thank the core team by name. Then she said my name clearly. Marin Whitlock's documentation work was absolutely essential to protecting the integrity of this entire integration process. Essential. I almost physically looked behind me to see who she was talking about. That word did not feel like mine yet. Then people in the room actually turned toward me and clapped. Not because I was someone's fiancé, not because I had made some man look good, simply because I had done the work myself. Afterward, Sable Wynn walked over and handed me my new permanent executive access badge in a small folder. No temporary stripe, no visitor designation, just my name and the security clearance level I had earned. I held it carefully in my palm and thought about Julian's napkin hitting the restaurant table with force. I can't keep pretending this is a partnership. He had been right about exactly one thing. It had never actually been a partnership. But now I had finally built something that was entirely and completely mine. Something no one could take away or diminish. Something that had my name on it. I sold the engagement ring on a cold, rainy Saturday in November. The jeweler asked me if I was absolutely sure about this decision. I almost laughed out loud. People always ask women if they are sure when they finally stop carrying around evidence of being chosen badly by the wrong person. Yes, I said clearly. I'm sure. I used part of the money from selling it to replace the dining table where Julian used to spread his laptop and ask me to just look over one quick thing for 3 uninterrupted hours. The new table I bought was smaller than the old one, round instead of rectangular. Mine. I put fresh flowers on it the very first night. Nothing expensive or fancy, just yellow tulips from the grocery store that made me smile. Then I sat down at that table with takeout food, my laptop, and a calendar that belonged only to me. No one asked me where I was going. No one mocked my job or made me feel small for caring about details. No one tried to turn my natural caution into evidence of a personality flaw. The quiet in my apartment felt unfamiliar at first, but not empty. It felt like a room that had finally been cleared of someone else's competing ambition. A space where I could finally breathe fully without making myself smaller. And I realized I liked the sound of my own company. 6 months later, I walked onto the executive floor without needing a security escort because my badge opened all the doors on its own. That small green light when I swiped my card still got to me sometimes. Not because access makes me better than anyone else, but because I clearly remembered being treated like my work was small and meaningless until powerful people desperately needed someone who understood exactly where truth was stored. Julian had called me just a clerk at dinner. He had meant it as an insult. But clerks know where all the bodies of bad decisions are permanently buried. We know which signature came first, which file mysteriously changed names, which timeline does not match the official story, which confident man copied language he could never actually explain when questioned. My life did not magically become perfect after Julian left. It became honest. I kept all my steady habits, my careful savings, my quiet mornings, my deep love of clean records and locked doors and written proof that could not be argued with. The only difference was that I finally stopped offering those particular strengths to someone who desperately needed to shrink them in order to feel tall himself. Julian walked out of that restaurant because I was just a clerk. Then my new job invite arrived with executive security protocols. And by the time he finally understood what that actually meant, I had already become someone he could no longer access. Someone he would never understand. Someone he had lost completely, and I was perfectly fine with that.